Very simple here what you're going to go do. One thing in terms of a topic to really talk about is if you look inside of Azure Active Directory and we go into the portal and we look at the different types of services that they have here. So I'll just drag over here a little bit of info. That might be too much info. But when you're inside of Azure Active Directory, you'll be able to see there's two areas. One is enterprise applications, and the other one is app registration. They're related, but they're not exactly the same thing. So essentially, let's talk about SAML. So first off, if you were, let's say we want to, we do SAML all the time. We have like HubSpot or Salesforce, and we tie that in. And what you normally do is an administrator who has application administrative rights or global admin rights. There's only a few that are allowed to go do this. They can go in enterprise application and go, oh, look, there's HubSpot. And in there's a lot of times in the market, in the documentation marketplace for Azure AD, it'll have many of the components in there, but there's still some work. You got to go into, let's say, HubSpot per se, in order to get the right key and copy that back into Azure AD in the enterprise applications area. Then it gives me a key and I paste it over there. So this is kind of sharing our secrets or certificates both ways. And then I get to set my claims of what users can do, what we pass in terms of roles or whatever those is. And now we have login authentication. Great, SAML, does all those things. So that's one way that you could do it, and it resides in enterprise applications. The other one, the one that we're going to focus most of it here, is on app registration. So in app registrations is a place where you get to define an application that you plan to use and code against, and you're going to tell what kind of scopes you want. Who are the people in the roles? What are the role types? What are the kind of consents that we're going to accept and go do? And that's kind of the beginning of where you'd have it. So you define your app registration here because you can put other areas. Is it a multi-tenant or a single tenant application? Are we going to support mobile and desktop or just web clients? Are we going to do single page applications, SPA apps, which requires different kind of token flow and all that? We're not going to go into all those details. So maybe if more people comment, we can go get a deeper session in the future. Anyhow, once you define what that app registration is, you configure your app service. Here's an app service. Well, what if it's a server that's on-prem or my desktop and developing? Yes, you can configure those. But in this example, I'm going to say it's an app service. I've written it in .NET, running on, doing .NET 7, running on Linux. It's an app service that's there, and all is great. So now I've wired up the application, and when I first run the application, I've only done app registration, and now it's going to go to authenticate and now get the scopes that I've defined, whether it's for users and groups. There's a ton of stuff you can do, SharePoint, Exchange, whatever. Now I have to consent for it. Now, if you're just an application developer and you put it in, you may not have the rights to go do that. And we're going to have a follow-up webinar that talks about how to manage this so it doesn't go crazy. But once you consent, wherever the admin consents for that, then an enterprise application gets created. So they're related. Why are they different? You'll find out in a little bit longer. So app registration is where I get to define this. This is where I say, when I get that, one of the things that I need is the client ID, which it gives me. That client ID is also the same in enterprise applications. It's a sneaky little thing. If you're doing conditional access policies, something you have to kind of look for, something we work with our customers, we do reporting. Anyhow, it's the same client ID, but one is an application registration, the other one's is a service principal that they have there. I'm not going to go into those deep topics. Anyway, pretty simple. Create the registration. Here's what I want because I have an application that I'm going to integrate with. And now I have to consent that says, yes, we consent now, and people can see it in my apps if it's been assigned to them. We can define the roles and all that. If I change anything in the app registration, because let's say I wanted to change what scopes I want to allow, then I have to reconsent the application. It's not a duplicate. It'll know which one's there and it'll consent. So internal application, this gets me started. If I'm doing, the same kind of process is in commercial, global, or, in GCC high. And so this kind of gets you started. Now your application is there. Now when people log in, they're going to log in with their Azure AD credentials, which means now we can make sure, we're tracking it with log analytics. We can do conditional access to start managing and constricting things, some more guidance on that later on. Now we're all wired up, GCI, everything's great. But again, it's going to go to login at Microsoft.us. When we call the graph endpoints, we have to call the right graph endpoint that's specifically in the Azure government or GCC high space, that you're calling. So pretty simple. Now, where things get a little bit interesting here is now let's talk about it, from an ISV perspective. Now, if you're only thinking about doing internal applications, you may go, well, this is too much for me. But as a consumer of these applications, you really should kind of follow along as we go through this. Now, in this kind of environment, we have two sets of spaces here. We have the commercial space here at the bottom, and then the government one up top. And by the way, this can be company A on the left and vendor one on the right, consuming all those services. And like I said, I'll talk a little bit about how you can mix this, not to say that it's what you would want to go do, but now some things become different. On the vendor side of it, they can create an app registration that's specifically for their application. Now, one thing to note, if you're a vendor that has a commercial tenant today, you're already doing this integration today, and you go, hey, can I just, point to, login at Microsoft.us in order to, have the users that are over here. Let me get a little fancy pen here. That, the customers that are in this tenant, can I just point the app registration to there and have it work? No, it won't work. And the reason it won't work is that the app registration client ID, which is unique to your application, and I will talk about how that can be shared across multiple tenants, will only be valid in the global space. It won't work in the GCC high space. They're different. If you did redirect them, the person will log in, and then it'll say, hey, you need to certify this, and then it'll fail because it'll say, I can't find the client ID. And that's because when it's trying to do the consent for that app registration in the customer's tenant, it's not in that GCC high Azure government space, so it will fail. So what this means is in order to support the application, you'd have to have a tenant yourself and the client ID registered here, and this is the one that the registration and consent will happen. So for this example, there are two separate zones. We have maybe one customer who has two tenant types, and we're one vendor, we have two tenant types. And in this example, there'd be a client ID that you would, I'm sorry, put that wrong here. Well, actually, this is a different scenario. You'd create the app registration, they would consent, it all works. Same thing over here. Now, to kind of expand on this scenario, which is per customer and hosted, there's different ways to do this. I'm not at this point giving recommendations like this is the best way or whatever, but it is one. Here you can see that, well, we actually created app registration here. This is possible where you can say, we have a service that we host, here it's an app service, but it could be, let's say, a virtual machine. And we want to dedicate this application instance or server instance to this customer. So one way you could do it is that the customer and their tenant creates the app registration, and then you configure it within your app service. Now, this would be something per customer hosted. There's ways to even make that dynamic, but anyhow. And then this app service runs. So, and then now that we have that, when the customer does go, log into the service, a consent will be required. That's in the customer's tenant, and the ways to control that. But again, let's say they say yes, and the application works. Now we have this URL that's for the customer, customer1.me-the-vendor.com. And now when they go to that URL and they log in, it's completely tied. So this would be one way of doing it per customer hosted. And on the customer side, they have full control of the app registration and the enterprise application, which means, that the vendor here still providing the service, still doing everything here. In that case, would they even need their Azure AD? No, they would not actually need their own Azure AD. So you could actually kind of take that out, because the service here is going, all identity authentication is happening at this level. Again, different ways, at this level. So different ways to architect that out. So this is one. And then you could do the same thing on this side of it, in this instance of it. So this is but one way. The more common way that you'll find that's out there is something like this. Now, in this instance, while I moved it up here, and really, actually, let me, give me a second, because I see that my fatal flaw in this particular part of it here. There we go. So this, nothing like building on the fly, huh? Is the same as this. Here we go. Sorry about that. There we go. Okay, back on track. So in this particular instance where we have, again, on the commercial side, this is the more common one where we've done a lot of the commercials, some of the GCCI space. The vendor creates an app registration. One, they have an app service that they have, and they use it across n number of customers, which I'll show here again in a little bit. And when the customer goes to this website, right, they just go, they log in, they register, and then now they get redirected to the login link that says, hey, this application needs to get approval for consent. You've probably seen this a lot of times. The screen will come up and say user profile, very basic. Normally people leave it open, but now this application is doing, workflow backend things. Maybe it's even doing automation for some of your, conditional access policies. So you give it a lot of application permissions, whatever that is. Now you give consent. So now there is one application registration. There's one time it's configured in the app service, and each customer has to consent. Now, in this scenario here, again, we're keeping things pretty simple. So, we have in this area, we would do the same thing in commercial. And again, in this scenario, we have let's say, different data centers. Over here I'm running Azure Global. Over here I'm doing Azure Government. The vendor is doing this, as well as the customer. They have 2 environments, or maybe they only have 1. Anyhow, this is how we're doing it. Very simple. Run registration, 1 config, n number of consents by customers. For customer, they just do this. When this happens, the customer doesn't see anything in that registration. It doesn't exist because that's not where it's defined. It's defined in the customer space.